Hi, I'm James Catherall. We are here at Valhalla High School. We're going to be doing an audio tour of their front ensemble setup. We're going to be talking a little bit about how just the general principles of setting up an audio system for a high school. So I'm generally going to try and do it in order from top to bottom. The first things we're going to talk about is going to be some of the most important stuff, some of the bare essentials that you'll need for a high school. And then as we go down the list, it's going to be the things that are either if you can afford it, it's really great things to have, or maybe if you already have the bare necessities and you're trying to upgrade or take your setup to the next steps, then these are some of the things you can start looking at getting. Obviously, first part of our setup and the most important of the essentials are the speakers. So the speakers they have here are active speakers. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but just sort of the basic setup of it. It has a 15-inch cone on bottom, and then it has the tweeter on top. And that's sort of your basic setup for the most part. Is you'll either want a single 15-inch cone on the bottom, or you can also do dual 15-inch cones. So you have two of them. Makes it a little bit of a larger speaker, but those are sort of the main two options. But usually I would stick with at least getting a 15-inch cone on as the bottom part, not going any smaller than that, because then you might not get the frequency range and the power that you need for your main speakers. The other part of it is how they have it set up. So the two main components that you want to be able to have control of, which this cart does, which is fantastic. The first one is the inward angle, which is obviously a lot simpler, is being able to make sure that you can tilt the speaker left and right and have it where you need it. Right now they have it set up perfectly. The most common thing I see with speakers a lot is not having or having the angle turned in too much. You almost barely need to turn it in. This just has a slight inward angle so that both speakers are just slightly in towards the middle of the bleachers, whereas most of your audience is sitting there and that's where the judges are, and that's typically where you want everything going, is more towards the middle of the area. You don't need to tilt it in too much. A lot of people will go too much and it almost kind of creates like an X pattern with how the speakers are shooting their sound. So you just need to be careful with that. The other thing you want to have control over is the upward angle. So these ones have control on the back of them so that you can tilt the speaker upward. And that's super important for marching band and outdoor stuff, because almost any stadium that you'll be in, there's going to be really nobody at ground level. So you don't want your speakers to be flat, because then a lot of your sound is going to be shooting towards nobody. You want to be able to tilt it up just a little bit to make sure it gets up to the people that you need. Now, looking here at the back, let's talk a little bit more about the difference between active and passive speakers, because they're really actually pretty similar. There's the cabinet, sort of the main part, which would be where your cones are, and that's where the sound is actually coming out of. And then you have your amplifier. And the difference between an active and a passive is where that amplifier is. So on an active speaker, we have our amplifier right here. So this is what is taking the signal from their mixer, putting it into here, boosting that signal so then it can be pushed out from their speakers. So we have the XLR cable, which is the output from their mixer, and then we have the power cable so that the speaker can be turned on. And then right here we have all of our different controls that we would need from the amplifier. The most important one being the level knob right there, so that we can set the level of the speaker to make sure that it's where we want it. And then we also just have a couple lights, similar things that you'd see on your power amp that you typically have, is the power LED, and then one that's letting you know you're getting signal, and then a limiter or protection to let you know if you're clipping or overriding the amp a little bit too hard. Whereas if you have a passive speaker, then the speaker itself won't have this on the back. It will only have a speak on, or maybe a 1/4 inch to be able to plug into it, and all it is just the cones to produce the sound, and the amplifier is separate that you'd put in a rack mount. One other thing that you'll notice as a major difference between active and passive speakers is with the active speaker on the amp, you'll typically have DCP, which is digital signal processing. So that gives you a little bit of control to be able to affect how the sound is coming out of the speaker. So on these Yamahas that they have, it has just a couple simple controls. Most of them is basically a crossover or a high pass filter right here. So you can use this to be able to roll off at 120 hertz or 100 hertz, or just turn it off so that it's just a flat EQ, flat sound coming out. And then same thing, it has this thing on the Yamaha speaker that's referred to as the D contour. That also is just a little bit of a sort of like EQ settings to adjust high and low frequencies coming out of the speakers. And different levels of active speakers will have different amounts of DSP. Some of them will have like amp modeling or other kinds of crazy things like that. Whereas a passive speaker and on the amp itself most likely won't have a lot of that DSP, just depending on the level of power amp that you get. The other part of our speaker setup is our subwoofer. So this is the larger speaker that's going to take care of those really low frequencies. The way they have it set up here is the way I really enjoy it, is having the sub separate from your mains. It's best to have your subs in one place. So they only have one sub, but even if I had two subs, I prefer to have my subs right next to each other in one spot. Typically either within the front ensemble, like in the second row, or sometimes you can put it in front of them. I don't like that one as much just because of the visual aesthetic of having the subs in front of everybody. Typically I like it back here. If you split up your subs, then that can just give you phase issues where the way the sound is coming out of the sub speakers, they can end up canceling out some of the low end frequencies depending on where your audience is sitting in the bleachers. So if you have it all in one place, then it drastically lowers that chance of having any type of phase cancellation where you won't get the full power out of your subs. So this is once again another powered sub. So it has the amp on the back right here with the XLR in, which is another output from their mixer, and then the power cable as well. And then along with some of the DSP right here, is it's got a digital display where we can see the level and any other type of DSP that we want to take care of on the back of the sub. The next main component is on equal level as the speakers as far as importance. You need the speakers to be able to amplify things, and then you also need a mixer to be able to plug all of your amplified things into it, whether it's your bass guitar, your microphones, your synthesizers, any type of stuff like that, you need to plug into your mixer. So just like with speakers, there's two main categories of speakers, active and passive. With mixers, there's two main categories. There's digital and then there's analog. So this one right here is a digital mixer. The most popular ones is the Yamaha TF, the Behringer X32, and then the PreSonus Studio Live series when you're going with digital mixers. As far as analog mixers go, Yamaha, Behringer, and Mackie all make really popular analog mixers. Let's talk about the difference between an analog and a digital mixer. If you pull both of them out of the box, brand new, plug in an XLR and a microphone into both of them, set the gain, and then you listen to it, you're not going to hear a huge quality difference between the two of them, especially if you get similar price points of each of them. There's not going to be an inherent difference between a digital mixer as far as the output of sound that you're getting from the speakers. But let's talk about some of the other reasons why you might want a digital mixer. Number one is you get a little bit more fine control over each of your channel strips inside of a digital mixer, where you'll have more control to be able to set a separate compressor on each channel strip. You can have a gate. You can have a little bit better parametric EQ on a digital mixer, where you'll have a little bit more control over what you're doing. And you'll have maybe a little bit better effects processing and DSP type of things on a digital mixer, as well as more routing capabilities than you would on an analog mixer. Some of the other ones that may be even a little bit better of why you'd want a digital mixer. Number one is you get the ability to save your settings on a digital mixer in a way that you can't on an analog. The best thing you could do on an analog mixer is take a picture of all the knobs and how you have it all set and where the faders are. That way you can reference it just in case something gets bumped. But on a digital mixer, you don't need to worry about things getting bumped because you can just recall saved settings and it'll go back to wherever you last saved it. That makes it way easier to make sure everything's going to stay the same on a digital mixer the way that you want it. The other thing with those saved settings is you also get the ability to quickly switch those settings in the middle of a performance. So that's most often referred to as scenes. So you can have different scenes on a digital mixer so that throughout the show you can change the balance of all of your channels and you can change your mix instantly by the press of one button. And then the final one that I think is one of the best things about having a digital mixer is you get what's referred to as remote mixing. You can plug your mixer into a wireless router via an Ethernet cable, and then you can connect to it either with an iPad or with a laptop, and you can control the mixer remotely from the bleachers or from the track or anywhere else, so that while the performance is happening, you don't just have to cross your fingers and pray that everything goes well. You have a little bit more control over what's happening to make sure if things are way too loud or something's getting crazy, you can pull something up, you can pull something down, you can make little adjustments that way. As far as setting up the mixer, because I also get a lot of questions about that. Usually my best advice with setting up the mixer, especially with things like EQ, is just using your ears and listening to what's coming out of the speakers and making adjustments. And then just getting familiar with the basics of an EQ, knowing that the left side of the EQ is the low frequencies, and then the right side of an EQ is going to be all the high frequencies. And then any adjustments you make is usually going to be really small. I'm not making huge wide adjustments on an EQ. It's all just little boosting here and there. And sometimes I'll have the player play something on the instrument, like on a marimba. I'll have them play a part of the show or maybe even just an exercise on the marimba, and then I'll adjust the EQs. I'll maybe boost some of the areas that I want, like maybe on a marimba, I'll boost some of the lower frequencies to give it just a little bit more warmth. Not the super low, but maybe like the low mid. And then overall on a mild instrument, I'll also probably do a low cut, and that gets rid of all of the low frame noise that'll happen when they're playing, that if there is any type of rattling, it can help eliminate some of that low thudding of the rattle. Now the next step, after you've got your speakers and you've got your mixer, you're gonna grab your microphones and you're gonna wanna amplify all the different things. So usually you're gonna start with your mild instruments. That's gonna be one of the first things you'll wanna amplify, because especially with like a marimba, is it doesn't really have the ability to compete volume-wise with some of the other instruments on the field, like your brass instruments or your battery instruments. So we wanna use these microphones. That way we can boost their volume without them either needing to hit the instruments really hard or to use really hard bright mallets. It gives us the ability for them to play with a little bit better touch, be a little bit more musical, and use some warmer, softer mallets to create different timbres out of these instruments. Now, I often get a lot of questions about what microphones to use, and I think there's two options that are super safe that always work for me. Number one is the SM57. These are fantastic microphones, and you can't go wrong with getting SM57s for basically any of your instruments in the front ensemble. Those are going to work really well. The other ones that I like a lot is the Audio-Technica. You can either get the AT2020 or the AT2035. Those are large diaphragm condenser microphones. Those also work really well. And once you get those ready, then you need to plug in your XLR cables, and then you need to do your cable management. So we don't want these cables just to be dangling all over the place. We're going to use these Velcro ties to keep the XLR cables on the instruments and to keep it clean. So we can see on these ones, they've set it up so that the cables are away from the audience so they don't see as much of the cables. The other thing that's really important with the cable management is here at the end is they've made it a loop at the end. The important thing you want to make sure you're not doing with XLR cables is doing any sharp bends with them where you're bending the cable and making a little pinch at the end, because that's going to damage the internal wiring of that cable. They should always be either in a loop or just in a straight line. As far as the amount of microphones, so on a marimba, typically the go-to is 2 microphones. You'll have one in sort of the middle upper range of the marimba, and then you'll have another one at the low range of the marimba. That gives you the ability to EQ them separately so that the low mic can be ready to pick up that warmer low sound of the marimba, and then the high mic can pick up some of that higher frequency upper range of the marimba. On a vibraphone, you'll typically only have one mic, and you can put it in the middle, or depending on what range of the instrument the player is playing on, you can put it on the lower part of the vibraphone or the upper part of the vibraphone. Also, it is valid to mic your glockenspiel and your xylophone. I've gotten great results out of miking both of those. You just want to make sure you're being really careful of how much you have the gain turned up and how that volume is set for both of those, because it can be really easy to overpower an entire ensemble if you end up miking your glock and your xylo. So now when you have all your microphones set up and you need to plug them all in, what you're going to need is some type of snake. So right here is one option of snake that you can use. So this one has a bunch of different channels on it so that everyone can bring their XLR cables into the middle of the pit or wherever is best to set the snake, and they can plug in all of their different microphone cables into here. And then this now takes all of those, and it has this big cable that goes over to the mixer, and you plug in all of the different cables of the snake into your mixer. So now instead of needing to take the cables from the microphone directly to the mixer, you now have this snake as an in-between. This plugs into the mixer, and then the microphones plug into here. So that way you can have slightly shorter cables. This method usually works pretty well if you have a smaller front ensemble and you don't have a whole bunch of cables to plug in here. I usually like to go with one of these methods because it's pretty easy. It doesn't take a whole lot of time to set up. You just need to get the microphone cables on the instruments, and then all the kids can plug into here, and then that goes to the mixer. It doesn't take a whole lot of extra planning or anything outside of that. It's pretty quick and painless to get this set up. The alternate method would be daisy chaining. That one takes a little bit more planning because now you're going to set up all of the XLR cables onto the mallet instruments. They're going to be plugging into each other, and then they'll plug into smaller stage box type of snakes that then will go into the mixer. So daisy chaining definitely takes a little bit more planning. We did do a video that covers daisy chaining, so you can check that out up here or down in the description. We'll put a link to that video. Now, when you need to hang your mics on your mallet instruments, this is my favorite system. I've seen a lot of different options and a lot of different pictures of people trying out some different things, but this has been the one that I've used the most and has gotten me the best results. So it's pretty much a homemade solution. We have our SM57 right here, and then we have Velcro straps around the center of it. And then we have these stretchy paracord that I get an entire big loop of it off of Amazon, maybe like 100 feet, 200 feet of it in one big loop. And then I just cut it down to the sizes that I need with scissors. And then I use a spring clip right here. And all you need to do is make a loop out of that Velcro tie. And then you can just drop the mic right into it. Make sure that it's a good diameter so that the mic won't slip all the way through, is that it holds it in place. And then I take each of these and I put it up through. I'll usually do it on the resonators, is I put it up through that metal bar that connects all the resonators together, put it back through the other side, and then I put it in through the spring clip, and then I pull it tight, and then it holds it in place like there. And then you just need to do it with all three of them. And I love it because it's really low profile. It's really affordable for this entire setup for one microphone. Maybe costs $1.50 at most for a single microphone. And you buy all of it in bulk. So it gives you as much as you need for a whole front ensemble plus more after that. It's really easy to raise or lower the height on the instrument. So if you want to change it and you want to change how the microphone is picking up the mallet instrument, all you have to do is loosen and move this string up and down. And now you've got a different height for your microphone. So now we've gone through some of the bare essentials, the things you really need no matter what. We've got the speakers, we've got the mixer, we've got the microphones, and then we went to the snake. So now after that, the next level that you'll want to start looking at is your electronics. So I have their two synth carts here with me right now. They are using MainStage, which you can either go with MainStage, which would be software synths, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then you can also go with hardware synths, which is things like a Yamaha Montage is a really popular one. Roland also makes some great hardware keyboards that you can use, as well as the Nord, but those are much more high-end and much more expensive. We'll talk about all of those in a second, but first, let's talk a little bit more about just the components of the synth carts and everything that we have here. So obviously you want to make sure, number one, it is able to hold everything that you need in it and it's a size that you like. I typically like having these extra sort of raised parts of them. It just covers some of the stuff we have here rather than just having like a bare open top where the entire audience can see everything that's on top of the cart. Usually it's nice to have this little area that just blocks it off a little bit, gives you a little bit of a cleaner look for the audience to look at. They don't have to see behind the curtain necessarily with all of these different cables and just the necessary items we have on a synth cart. Moving down here on the bottom, starting with some of the stuff we've already addressed a little bit. We have our mixer right here. This is their Yamaha TF rack digital mixer. They also have a power conditioner right here. So this is what's providing power to most of the stuff on their synth cart. And a power conditioner is just taking the input power and it sort of cleans it up just to make sure that you're not dealing with maybe any sort of like dirty power is what it's referred to, where it's not a consistent 115 to 120 volts that you want. And it also helps if there's any like surges or spikes or things like that. It can just make sure that there's a consistent level of power for all of your equipment to run off of, because all of your audio equipment is going to need around 115 to 120 volts. It doesn't need to be an exact 120 volts. A lot of audio equipment is able to handle a slight variance in that voltage. Moving from there, after you have all of that, you're going to want that in a rack mount just to keep it all stable so that when you're moving around, this stuff isn't just loose, but it is rack mounted in so it's stable and it's able to travel around and be safe. Now let's go looking on top. Over here on this side, we have our UPS. That's an uninterruptible power supply. So what that does is it gives you basically a battery so that if you do lose power for any reason, this can keep things powered up But most importantly, its function in a front ensemble is when we finish warming up and we're going from a warm up to a performance, we can keep all of our gear powered on with this battery. So that way we don't have to turn everything off and then back on. This thing will keep everything powered. And usually I try and get one that has enough to give me between 30 to an hour. Usually an hour is the best. That way I have plenty of time and I'm not like down to the second in case something happens, if maybe the show gets delayed or something like that. We have plenty of extra time so no one's stressing out that we might power down before we even get to the field. And that's just important because things like digital mixers and computers and stuff like that, they turn on relatively quickly, especially in the year 2023. A lot of this stuff turns on pretty quickly, but for the constraints of the pageantry where we have to set up in like 2 to 3 minutes, a digital mixer will take 45 seconds to a minute to turn on. Same thing with a computer. It will probably take somewhere in the range of 30 to 45 seconds to turn on, as well as a wireless router and just some of your other components. Some of those things take between 30 seconds to a minute, maybe a little bit longer, and you don't want to have to use up that time when you're setting up on the field. The UPS will keep it all on so that you're turning that on beforehand and it's all ready to go on the field instantly because of your UPS. The next thing is giving your keyboard player the ability to hear themselves, which is often referred to as like a monitor. So you can either get that as an external speaker, as you might see like a little speaker sitting on a synth cart, and that allows the player to hear themselves because electronic instruments don't have that acoustic feedback that you would get from a mallet instrument. Is you can hit it and the player can instantly hear themselves and know that they're making sound, obviously, whereas a keyboard player can't hear themselves. There's nothing here that's inherently making sound. It's all coming out of the speakers in front of them. So to allow them to hear themselves clearly, you can either get one of those small speakers that you would then plug into your mixers. You'd use an output from the mixer to go to that speaker so they can hear themselves. Or you can use one of these. This is a Behringer P2. So it's just a little personal monitor where you can plug in just normal 3.5 millimeter headphone jack into there. It's got its own little volume knob so that the player can control their own volume themselves, and then they have their headphones. So now they can just put those into their ears and they can hear themselves. I personally like that a lot better rather than the speaker, just so that they can have full control over it. They can clearly hear themselves, and I can do things like maybe giving them a click track in their ears that no one else will hear. It's only coming in through their headphones. So that's another really important layer that you want to think about when you're setting up your electronics, is making sure that your electronic players have a way to hear themselves. Other things is just nice things to have. We have a little bit of storage right here. These ones are important just so you have things ready to go on the field during a rehearsal, that you don't have to run back to your band room and then come back and waste all of that time. You just have things that are convenient to have, like electric tape, pencils, batteries, maybe backup USB cables, backup XLR cables, just things like that, so that if you need it in a pinch, you have it right there on your synth cart. And especially for something like a performance, I like to have all of those backup type of items so that if it is broken or it does break when we're setting up, then we can just quickly grab it on the synth cart instead of being in that panic state where it's like, oh my God, we need this thing and it's on the field, we're getting set up for a performance, this thing broke and we don't have the backup with us. I usually like to keep it on the synth card. That's a great place to keep all that stuff stored. Let's talk a little bit more about using MainStage and a software synth type of setup. So right here we have what's called a MIDI controller. So I like to think of these almost kind of like a video game controller, where you're just using it to control something else. So a MIDI controller doesn't have any inherent sounds in it. Same thing like a video game controller. Your Xbox controller doesn't have video games in it. You use that controller to control the Xbox and to play your games. Same thing with a MIDI controller. I use the MIDI controller to control the computer and trigger all of the things on that. MIDI controllers tend to be much more affordable than a hardware workstation, stage keyboard type of situation like a Montage. I believe this is the M Audio Key Station. This is a great MIDI controller. I believe it's somewhere in the range of about $250 for this 88 key version. The other thing you'll notice is there's not a lot of bells and whistles on this. It's just the piano keys. It's got a couple knobs here. This is your mod wheel and your pitch bend, couple buttons and a fader, and that's really it. There's not a bunch of other buttons. There's not a bunch of faders that you might see on some MIDI controllers. For marching band and indoor drumline and anything like that, I really like to keep it simple because the performer isn't really going to need any of those buttons or those faders or things like that. It just adds extra cost that I'm personally not going to be using for anything that we do. Other thing you're going to want along with your MIDI controller is the sustain pedal. These are super important. The other thing is these are notoriously bad build quality of just all of them. I've never found a sustain pedal that lasts me as long as I want it to. These things go bad really quickly, so it's important to have extras of these. And luckily, they're not super expensive. This one, I believe, is around $30. So you always want to have a backup of these on your synth cart because this will go bad, and it will go bad at the worst time. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about the important part, and that's the computer for MainStage. So it is an Apple exclusive program, so you do need a Mac computer to be able to run it. You can't have any type of Windows machine if you want to use MainStage. So for Valhalla High School, they have a Mac Mini. This is an M2 Mac Mini with 24 gigabytes of RAM. I would say no matter what computer you get, the absolute bare minimum would be 8 gigabytes of RAM. I think if you're a smaller school that's not really doing a whole lot on the computer, you'll be pretty okay with 8 gigabytes of RAM. If you're going anything above that, I would say getting 16 gigabytes is the next like base level that I go with, is making sure if I'm going to start using third-party stuff or I'm doing a little bit more in-depth stuff, I'm going to want 16 gigabytes of RAM. Finally, if you're really going hard on the external libraries and doing a whole bunch of stuff in there, then you might want to start thinking about going up to like 32 gigabytes of RAM. The great thing is, Apple makes great computers and they last a really long time. So nowadays, when you're picking out an Apple computer or a Mac, you can go pretty far back. I'd say even as far back as like 2018, 2017, and you can still find a great computer that'll last you a long time without needing to drop a whole bunch of money. Only thing you really want to keep in mind is getting at least 8 gigabytes of RAM. If you can afford it, I would really suggest 16 gigabytes of RAM, and then at least 256 gigabytes of storage. And then once again, if you can afford it, 500 gigabytes is really a great place where you really won't run out of space. And then after that is getting MainStage software. It's only $30. Fantastic price. I did another great video about how awesome that price is. I'll put that one in the description as well, but it's only a $30 program, gets you a whole bunch of stuff. We have a whole lot of videos that go really deep into MainStage, so you can check out our whole MainStage playlist. I'm not going to talk a whole bunch about it right now, just because we have a full library of playlist of stuff for you guys to check out. If you do have a Mac Mini, you need to make sure you have a monitor, you have a mouse, and you have a keyboard to be able to use, a computer keyboard that you can use. None of those things need to be super expensive for a Mac Mini for marching band type of stuff. I usually just get the cheapest mouse, the cheapest keyboard, and the cheapest monitor because none of them need to be super high grade to work really well. Now let's move on to their second synth cart. So this one is actually performing a really important function. All of the sort of synth sounds that are being created are all coming off of their main Synth 1 cart, but they have a second MainStage setup right here. And this is actually for their field microphones that they have set up on the front sideline. Field microphones is something that have been getting really popular in the last few years. It is really affordable, but it is also a really dangerous thing to get into. So just make sure you're doing your research on field mics and knowing how to use them. For me, if I'm ever using field mics, I know I want to run it through MainStage because that gives me a lot of control. One of the important things with field mics, number one, is they definitely should not be on for an entire performance. I don't want to just set up field mics and just leave them there and a whole performance goes by and they're just doing everything. It's picking up everything and it's making sound for everything. I want to have the ability to control it. So that's what they're doing here with MainStage. They have an audio interface down here. This is a Tascam 1608 where they have another snake. So right here, they have the D'Addario Stagebox snake that has 8 inputs on it. And then it uses the DB25 cable to plug in, and then you use a breakout snake into your audio interface. So this is where they have their 6 inputs for their 6 field mics that they're using. And now this audio interface goes into MainStage. And so now inside of MainStage, I can then take those 6 inputs and create 6 audio channel strips that are attached to those microphones. And now I have full control of them inside of MainStage to change the gain so that every time I change a patch, I can change the gain of those audio channel strips, or I can mute them depending on the patch. So I can go to a different patch and mute that channel strip, and now those mics will be turned off anytime we're on that patch. You can also do EQ inside of MainStage. You can maybe add a little bit of reverb if you want to. You can do input delays inside of MainStage, and you can do a lot of other things to have full control over those field mics so that it's not just one volume and one sound the entire time. I can turn them on, I can turn them off, I can make them louder, I can make them softer. All right, so now let's go on to some even deeper levels. This is something that is nice to have if you're able to afford it, or if you're looking for that next step of doing something interesting with your audio setup, is wireless microphones. It's another one that's pretty popular. A lot of people love trying to do wireless microphone stuff. It's another one that can get really dangerous if you're not ready to spend the money on it. Wireless is something that you absolutely never want to go cheap on. You have to be ready to get the money to get the right gear, or it can actually end up hurting you more than helping you. So for this one, they have their Shure QLXD. That is one of the great options that you'll want to get if you're going to do wireless stuff. Usually expect to spend somewhere between $1,000 to $1,300 for every wireless mic that you want to have on the field. So if you want to mic 2 people, be ready to spend $1,300 on each of those, or a total of $2,600. Because you need your wireless receiver, which is right here. You need the transmitter, which is right here. This is what goes on the performer. Is they plug this in, they have the microphone, they strap that to their instrument, and then that's where the sound is being picked up. And then you can run it either with the built-in antennas or the antennas that come in the box, or you can get one of the paddles right here, which can give you a little bit more of a stable connection with its raised height so that you won't have any of those audio dropouts. That's what you're going to experience the most, especially if you don't get the right wireless equipment. You're going to experience dropouts where you won't have a stable connection, and when the person is trying to play, their mic will either cut in and out or it'll just make no sound at all. So that's why it's really important to get the right gear when you do wireless. Final part that you want to think about. This one's super important with any level of audio setup, whether you have just a little bit of gear or you have a whole bunch of stuff and it's really involved, is you want to think about how that setup process is going to go. For me, one of the things I really keep in mind is almost trying to model it after something like McDonald's. It feels a little bit silly to think about it that way at first, but think about how the McDonald's kitchen and their, behind the counter has all been designed. It's a really in-depth process. If you think about it and you just have to describe and talk about what needs to happen in the kitchen of a McDonald's, there's a lot of cooking that needs to happen, there's a lot of different processes, there's a lot of steps to be able to get that food prepped and ready to be brought to a customer. And the thing that makes it the craziest is that they are able to have that set up in such a streamlined process and so intuitive and easy to follow that you don't even need a background in food prep to be able to get a job at something like a McDonald's or any of those types of fast food services. They have it all set up, and it's boiled down to such an easy step-by-step process that anybody can follow it and be trained in no more than maybe like a single day and a single shift. Now, attaching that to what we do here is thinking about the same thing. I want my setup to be so intuitive and so streamlined that someone without audio experience can set everything up and make all of it work. And that takes a lot of prep and a lot of thought in going into that setup process. So that means things like labeling all of your equipment so that it's easy to read. Usually I'll do a lot of things with color coding. That makes it really easy just to match colors. When we're getting to the field, you just need to match colors on everything and then it's ready to set up. Or you can do that with numbers. That also works well when you're plugging into things, especially if you write it nice and big so it's easy to read. Anytime I'm doing these things and I'm putting all this together, I'm always thinking through those steps and asking myself, can someone without any prior experience, can I get a high school freshman or a high school sophomore to be able to come up with no prior experience and set all of this up without a whole lot of explanation? So that's just a super important one that you want to think about all those details. Label everything that you can. It even comes down to the speakers. I'll put tape on the backs of speakers that says what yard line and what side of the field it's supposed to be on. That way it's just super easy, because sometimes I'll even have help from parents or from staff members or other people that aren't super familiar with all the gear, but it's still set up in a way that's really easy for them to understand. They don't need to have deep audio knowledge to be able to help with the setup process. All right, that's it for this video. I want to give a huge thank you to Valhalla High School and their marching band staff for allowing us to hang out at their rehearsal and shoot this video. Hopefully it was helpful for you guys. I'm going to put links for all the gear that we talked about down in the description so you guys can check all that out and start putting together your own sound systems for your marching band. If this video is helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you give it a like. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next one.